Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to our final presentation of the third annual Vegfest with YouTuber Mexie. And a reminder at 5:15, everyone's going to be back here for a panel discussion, so bring those questions. If you missed some of the talks earlier, it's a great chance to kind of recap on what those presentations were all about. So Mexie hosts a popular YouTube channel where she provides grounded critiques of capitalism and explores issues relating to social, environmental, and economic justice and veganism. She is a published author and holds a PhD in human geography, for which she received a SSHRC scholarship.
Her work explores the intersections between political economy and environmental governance with research sites in Canada and Thailand. She's been a leftist as long as she can remember, a vegetarian for 10 years, and, it says in brackets, finally, vegan for 4 years as well. She also co-hosts a leftist podcast, The Vegan Vanguard, with Maureen from A Privileged Vegan. Please welcome to the stage, Mexie.
Thank you, everybody. Okay, great. I have notes with me. I thought there might be a podium, so I'm just going to be holding them here. So good afternoon. Thank you for coming out to this talk. I also want to thank Menica and the rest of the organizers for having me here. I'd like to begin, just like Lauren did, with acknowledging that we are on Indigenous territory. We are on Indigenous land, the territory of the people of Treaty 7 in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wellesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And so I'd also like to just acknowledge that land acknowledgements are just really the tip of the iceberg. Once we acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land, we also have a responsibility to work towards reconciliation and decolonization. So learning about the laws of the nations that we actually inhabit, and then working as treaty people to honor our responsibilities. So today my talk is listed as dealing with the environment, which I'm going to talk about, but the title of my talk is Why Vegan TM is Not Enough. So as you can tell, I'm going to be going a bit deeper than just that. So I'll start with why we should be dropping meat for environmental reasons. And then I'm going to go into why what I call the vegan TM approach, which is basically consuming vegan products alone without challenging the broader social, political, and economic structures, or otherwise without challenging an economy that puts profits over animals and the environment and people is incredibly important. It's a great start, but it's ultimately insufficient for bringing about animal liberation or even bringing about a sustainable future. So although we should be working to shift everyone's consumption towards vegan options, I'm going to outline today why we need to be doing more to really politicize animal rights. So let's begin with the environment. So as a teenage undergrad, I started taking environmental studies, and one of the first things I learned was about how unsustainable meat production and consumption truly is. It was incredibly alarming for me. I was about 18 years old. I just could not believe it. And that was over 10 years ago now. And as we can tell, things have not improved since that time. So we're really in a critical moment right now when it comes to climate change and the environment with respect to the continuation of our species, but also millions of others. And so I know that most vegans are probably aware to some extent about the environmental impacts of meat, but I'm going to start for people who are vegan curious with why we need to drop meat and animal products for a more sustainable future. So first of all, it's just simply inefficient to be the secondary consumer. And by that I mean we grow crops and then we feed them to animals, and then we eat those animals and additional crops instead of just eating the original crops themselves, right? So that makes us the secondary consumer. And doing that, we need 18 times the land space for omnivorous diets than we do for vegan ones. And this land space is mostly being cleared in the rainforest. So we're losing 1 to 2 acres of rainforest every second, which is a really staggering statistic that I don't think our brains don't even really have a context for that amount of destruction. Animal agriculture is also responsible for 91% of Amazon rainforest destruction, so this is a lot. And this is because land needs to be cleared first to grow all of these crops to feed to the animals, and land also needs to be cleared to house all of these animals in these huge concentrated factory farm operations. And when you clear land in this way, you're contributing doubly to climate change. So especially if you're clearing forest, you're losing a carbon sink when you're clearing that area, and then you're also contributing greenhouse gases through factory farming. So carbon sinks are things like trees, vegetation, etc. Also bodies of water. These are things that absorb CO2 from our atmosphere, and in the case of vegetation, then it re-emits oxygen, right? So these are very important. So when you lose carbon sinks, if you're losing a forest, for example, first of all, if those trees are burned, then all of that carbon that's stored in those trees then gets re-emitted back into the atmosphere. And as kind of a double whammy, now you don't have that forest there to act as that carbon sink to reabsorb all of that CO2. So you just have more CO2 sitting out there in the atmosphere warming the planet. So you can see how that's kind of contributing doubly to the climate crisis. Livestock also emits methane, a 25 times more powerful gas than CO2 when it comes to global warming potential. So even a small amount of that gas being emitted is really concerning. And animal agriculture also emits the majority of our nitrous oxide emissions, which is a 300 times more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2. So also very concerning in small quantities. So the diets of meat eaters actually create 7 times the greenhouse gases than those of vegans. So this is pretty momentous. And people really are thinking, let's move away from beef, right? Because beef is one of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases when it comes to animal food. But I would say, all animal products are inefficient because we are ultimately that secondary consumer. So chicken as well. If every American dropped even 1 serving of chicken per week from their diet, that would save the same amount of CO2 as taking 500,000 cars off the road. So no matter what animal we're talking about, it is significant to be reducing your meat consumption. Because raising animals in this way requires so much corn and soy and grains to be fed to the animals, it also requires so much fresh water. So the industry is a very thirsty industry. It uses about 1/3 of the planet's fresh water. And you'd save more water not eating 1 pound of meat than you would for not showering for 6 months. So again, this is very significant. And then you have to think about all of the excrement coming from all of these animals, right? The animal waste is just absurd. And this pollutes all the nearby soils and the waterways. So in the US alone, factory farms create 500 million tons of animal waste per year, which is more than 3 times the amount that are produced by American citizens. And all of this is stored in these huge lagoons, which often leak all of their contents full of bacteria, full of pesticides, full of viruses and pathogens into the surrounding groundwater. So it obviously affects the neighboring communities and also just the ecosystems themselves. And if there are hurricanes, etc., these are prone to flooding, and so then you just have the surrounding areas being flooded with millions of gallons of manure full of really toxic stuff in there. As well, people living near these concentrated factory farms are experiencing a lot of respiratory illnesses and even brain damage because they're breathing in all of this toxic gas that's ammonia and hydrogen sulfide from the decomposing manure. And also particulate matter that gets sprayed into the air. So it's really affecting, the health and the safety of people and ecosystems around these slaughterhouses. People think that fish is perhaps a sustainable alternative, but the state of our global fisheries is also quite alarming. I'm sorry, this is a very depressing talk. Most of my talks are just very, very sad. So many of our fisheries are being exploited at or beyond capacity, and some scientists are predicting a collapse by 2050. And our ocean environments are deeply affected by our overwater environment. So it's very affected by climate change as well. Because the ocean is a carbon sink, as I said, so it absorbs CO2. So the more we pump up there, the more the ocean absorbs CO2, and it acidifies. So it turns to carbonic acid, which obviously does not support aquatic life. And as well as the oceans warm, we're seeing a rise in coral bleaching, which is basically just the corals, they turn white and they die, and then they can no longer support life, which has many ripple effects. So it's bleak. There's no doubt that this food system is unsustainable. And I'm going to be talking later today about why we need to do more than just individual consumption, but the best thing that you can do individually to cut your greenhouse gas emissions in half right now would be to go vegan. So it is impactful. There's a campaign called Meatless Mondays that I believe still has a website that tells you how much greenhouse gas, how much land space, et cetera, you would save if you just drop meat every Monday for every Monday of the week. So it's pretty compelling if you're vegan curious to go check that out. Okay, but is consumption enough? Can we fix this through consumerism alone? And here we get into what I'm calling the vegan, quote unquote, TM movement, trademark, which is basically consuming vegan without challenging these broader social, political, and economic structures that we're living within. So treating animal rights as somehow disconnected from broader political movements, from broader systems. So although there has been a stark rise in the amount of vegans, in the amount of vegan products, in the amount of vegan consumption, this has not slowed the meat production industry. So meat production and consumption has continued to rise. And in fact, it has quadrupled since the 1960s. And the FAO says that meat production could again double by 2050, which frankly we do not have the resources for. Like, that is not something that we can allow to happen. So that's quite alarming. And of course, part of this has to do with the growing population. It also has to do with people, like a growing middle class in a lot of emerging economies like China, for example. So more people are able to access meat. But per capita, meat consumption has increased approximately 20 kilograms since 1961. So people are just generally eating more meat, and they're eating meat more often. They're eating meat every meal, for example. And so this increase means that meat production has been growing at a much faster rate than the rate of population growth. So this is quite alarming. So more vegans and more vegan consumption has not actually translated into less animals being bred into the system. So making vegan consumption profitable has not made meat production unprofitable. And so again, although it is important for all of us to do what we can and to consume vegan as much as is possible, and to get everyone else to do so as well, we're going to need to go a bit further than that. So we're going to take a look first at some of the problems inherent with just consumer-based activism. So I'm going to start with access. And Lauren Ornell has talked about this in the previous talk, which was really amazing. But I'll begin with the first contradiction of our capitalist system itself, which is the contradiction of overproduction or overaccumulation. So basically, in a bid for profits, in any given market, we will tend to overproduce because we want to produce, we want to get those profits. So eventually, the market will become saturated. So people will no longer be buying what you're selling. Or if you think about neoliberal economic reforms, et cetera, there will be such a downward pressure on wages, on benefits, et cetera, as Lauren was talking about, people not making a living wage anymore in this economy, that people won't be able to afford what you're selling. And a great example of this is that we actually overproduce food. So we overproduce, we produce 1.5 times the amount of food that we would need to feed everyone on the planet. It is just not being distributed to everyone. I know a lot of vegans will say, if you want to stop global hunger, go vegan, right? Well, we already have the food, right? It's not that we don't have the food, it's not being distributed, because food is a commodity and not a social right. And it's actually more cost effective to waste 40% of the food that we produce than to actually distribute it to hungry people. So in terms of the animal agriculture industry, 26.2% of all meat that enters the US retail market ends up in the garbage. So it just ends up in the landfill. All of these animals are being grown and slaughtered for no reason, for that to just go into a landfill. So this translates into 25 billion fish, 15 billion shellfish, 1 billion chickens, and 100 million other land animals. So that's a lot. And this is happening at the same time that millions of people struggle to access healthy vegan food, or even food at all, right? There's a lot of people living with food insecurity, So as much as vegans like to say that veganism is accessible on any budget, it's not always the case, and there are many intersecting structural reasons why people aren't able to access 100% vegan consumption all the time. And so instead of denying this, vegans who want to see more people accessing vegan products and accessing a plant-based lifestyle would do well to understand these structural barriers to access and seek to dismantle them. And for that, we have to get a little bit more political. So for example, structural racism and class-based oppression lead to the proliferation of food deserts, which predominantly affect low-income communities and communities of racialized minorities. So 23.5 million people live in urban neighborhoods or rural towns with limited access to fresh, affordable, healthy food. 2.1 million households do not own a car, and they live more than 1 mile away from the nearest grocery store. People in poor socioeconomic areas have 2.5 times the exposure to fast food and 30% more exposure to convenience stores. And these are places that do not tend to have anything healthy, certainly not many things vegan. So buying whatever you like does not actually reflect the experience of millions of people. And we can't actually address this issue without addressing systemic racism, gentrification, and capital flight, and our corporate food regime. Also, there has been wage stagnation since the 1970s, since neoliberal economic reforms that swept the globe and tried to quote-unquote free markets in the interest of capital. And so labor's share of the output of profits has declined significantly. And jobs have been outsourced, jobs are continuing to be outsourced, and they are now increasingly being automated. So even if people try to come together and unionize and demand better working conditions, better pay, more living wages, etc., there's always the threat that that company will either outsource further or just automate the positions away. So we're looking at a future where labor has less and less power with respect to capital. And you can only vote with your dollars if you have adequate dollars. So these are things we're going to have to think about in terms of making sure that this movement is something that will be accessible to working class people now and into the future. And on top of that, those with the most dollars get the most votes. So you have the meat and dairy lobby, which is very heavily influencing our food guides, our advertising, etc. Okay, so putting access aside just for a while now, so pretending that we're just talking about middle-class people, for example, who have no problems with food insecurity and they can just access vegan products all the time. Another major issue is conglomerates. So capital tends to concentrate into fewer and fewer hands, and so even if we are purchasing vegan products, the company could be owned by a much larger non-vegan conglomerate, and then our vegan product is just one more avenue of profit among many non-vegan ones. So this is how we can see an increase in vegan consumption, but also an increase in meat production and consumption. So for example, these are just some examples. Alpro is owned by Danone, the largest dairy company in the world. Field Roast, which is awesome. These are all great brands. It's not to knock the brands, it's just to give an example of what I'm talking about. So Field Roast is owned by Maple Leaf Foods, which is predominantly a meat company. Silk is owned by Dean Foods, the largest milk producer in the US. So Delicious is owned by White Wave. So again, these are just a few examples, but these acquisitions just really represent growth opportunities for these businesses that continue to exploit animals. Haagen-Dazs ice cream, for example, which has a number of vegan products, is owned by Nestle. And Nestle is, of course, not a vegan company. It's also infamous for water privatization around the world. For example, draining Lake Michigan while Flint still does not have any clean water. And also the chocolate that the company uses is among the most unethical available. And shout out to Lauren Ornelas again, who did an amazing talk before mine about different forms of chocolate and where they're sourced from and whether they're ethical or not. You can check that out on Food Empowerment Project. But in terms of Nestle, it's sourced from West Africa, and it relies heavily on child slave labor. And a lawsuit in California actually implicated Nestle in trafficking children, trafficking Malian children to the Côte d'Ivoire to work on cocoa farms. So not really cruelty-free, even though it is vegan, right? Chick-fil-A is another example of a company that kills a lot of animals, and they're also They've been in the limelight for being quite a homophobic company. The CFO has opposed same-sex marriages and donates money to foundations that are hostile to LGBTQ rights, but they have a vegan salad. And so, should we fill up their pockets to show them that we demand more vegan options like that salad? I'm not sure. So the point of this is that ethical consumption in general is quite tricky within these broader systems, right? And so, of course, as vegans, we're trying to do the least amount of harm possible, and of course, consuming vegan does do the least amount of harm possible, but it also requires us to be more cognizant of these broader systems within which we're operating and the commodity chains that we're participating in, right? So in terms of environmental impacts, industrial agriculture itself is also very unsustainable and very, very harmful to animals in general. And so once again, eating vegan within this system is far better than not eating vegan. But again, we can't really stop there. So A Foodie's Guide to Capitalism looks at just the unsustainability of our corporate food system. Commercial agriculture, it was tied to the dawn of capitalism itself through enclosure acts, which kicked all the peasants off of their land and made them basically leave, go into the cities to be poor laborers. And it concentrated land, agricultural land, into fewer and fewer hands. And this process continues today through land grabs in the global south. So people are still losing access to their land, losing access to their means of subsistence, and just being kind of kicked to the curb to go try to work as a poor laborer. Monsanto, bought out by Bayer, dangerously controls most of our food system and our seeds, which is very alarming. Huge monocrops also disrupt our nutrient cycle. And the pesticides that we use are really harming our soils to the point that Scientific American reported that we only have 60 years of farming left if things continue at this pace. 60 years is a figure that I don't think people really are really conscious of and really take as seriously as they should. Some of the most dangerous pesticides are neonicotinoids, and they are killing off all of our pollinators. Sorry, it's hard to hold this in, also fix my bags. But as you know, our pollinators are suffering, our pollinators are dying, and we need pollinators for the continuation of our food system. So does it make sense as a vegan to not consume honey, but then consume vegetable products that are grown using these neonicotinoid pesticides that are killing off all of our bees and all of our pollinators? And if you're thinking, oh, no problem, I'll just eat organic, local all of the time, again, not everyone is able to access that. We're going to need to remove those barriers if people are going to be able to do that. And so capitalism also turns problems, or what would be problems for its continuation, into new avenues of profit and growth. So there's now an exciting new pollinator service industry that involves trucking around billions of bees and trucking them all around the country to be let out to pollinate all of these huge monocrops where we don't have pollinators to do that anymore. These pollinators used to do that for free, but now here we are. And so a great example is in California with all the almond fields there. And so 660,000 acres of almonds translates into 20 billion visiting bees. So again, consumer-based activism, or like a vegan TM activist will be like, okay, I am contributing to bee liberation by not eating honey, but might overlook these broader connections of these broader systems that we're living within. So as well, this corporate food model is expansionary, so it's just not a sustainable model that will allow for the flourishing of animals and humans at the same time. And also we can think about just straight up consumer goods, right? Like we can think about cell phones. Do we think that those are cruelty-free? The cobalt for those is being mined in the Congo by children who are dying in the mines, working in very dangerous conditions. It's polluting the environment as well. And so, as well, the US military has also staged coups there to install violent dictators to basically continue them access, to continue to allow the US access to that resource, right? And this is all based on economy. This is all based on economic growth, staking a claim over those resources. So are we not doing harm by purchasing these, right? Can we say that we are ethical or we are cruelty-free because we are not consuming certain products but overlooking what's going on in the broader system? So consumerism alone does not equal cruelty-free. I hope I've made that clear. So yes, the least we should be doing is consuming vegan. The least we should be doing is consuming as best we can with whatever we can. But we're going to need to really dismantle these systems, not try to finagle within them. And I know that many vegans are anti-consumerist, many vegans are minimalist, and they are intent on buying as little as possible, which is honestly great. But ironically, within this broader framework, this broader economic capitalist framework, if people stop buying, then we'll be in crisis. If the system will stagnate, right? If nobody's buying anything, then jobs will be lost. People will be struggling to afford those vegan products that they take for granted now. So the necessity for growth encourages these creations of false demands. So if we're going to fight consumerism, we're going to have to take aim at this broader economy that is really set up for profit and not really for the flourishing of people, for the planet, and for the animals. So there are innumerable people who are making connections between different movements, between speciesism, between racism, sexism, transphobia, ableism, etc. And I'm not going to go into all of that today, but if you'd like to come see me after, I can give you some names and some resources of people who are doing really great work making those connections. But I will say, or I just will add, that another aspect or another issue with treating veganism as just a consumption list means that it can also facilitate other forms of oppression within the movement, because then you can have people who are just consuming vegan but perpetuating harm in other ways. But again, I won't go into that today. So to counter all this, today I am arguing for veganism as a political stance, not merely a grocery list. So as a political stance, this movement stands to link up with other movements that are fighting for total liberation more broadly within this political economy. As a political stance, veganism rejects the commodity status of animals. So animals are not commodities. Animals are here with us. They are not for us. And as beings, as sentient beings with autonomy, bodily autonomy, with agency, they should be respected as such. As a political stance, veganism also stands against speciesism, which is a form of oppression or domination or discrimination that's similar to patriarchy, capitalism, racism, that deems certain lives to be quote-unquote less than. So it's institutional discrimination and individual prejudice against non-human animals based on their species. It is violence against non-human animals perpetrated by the privileged human species, usually for the benefit of humans. So this divides humans from animals, obviously, but this also sets up hierarchies within the animal kingdom itself. And so, we have animals that are our companions. We have dogs and cats that we love and we welcome into our homes. We have animals that we loathe, that we view as pests, like rats, like pigeons, etc. And we want to exterminate them. We have other classes of animals that we want to preserve somewhere out there that we find really majestic, like lions, like giraffes, etc. And then we have classes of animals that we deem it okay to cage and to keep in horrible confined conditions, never seeing the sun, never stepping outside. We deem it okay to breed them for traits that we want, traits that actively harm their health and their ability to even have mobility. We deem it okay to rip their babies away from them, treating them all just like commodities, right? So people who believe that this is wrong, people who believe in animal liberation, who are in support of the ethical framework of veganism, will implement that into their lives as much as is possible and practicable. And I say possible and practicable because we talked about access before. We talked about these broader systems that make it difficult for some people to access this. So this will look differently for everyone based on socioeconomic factors, for example. We really need to make this a movement that is relevant for working class people. And if we don't, I don't see this as a movement that's really going to go that far, right? And as well, you might have problematic relationships to food, whatever. So veganism implemented as a political stance will look different for everyone. Does this mean that we can all just consume animal products? No, absolutely not. We should do this as much as is possible and practicable. But it means that purity politics do not really have a place in the movement. It's not useful. And it means that we need to do so much more, right? There's so much more activism we need to be doing. We need to be dismantling these barriers. We need to be fighting for total human and animal liberation because these truly are linked. So for example, the prison industrial complex. This is a obviously racist institution. A lot of structural racism is involved in that. And also, it contracts out labor, right? It contracts out labor, which is basically slave labor because it's compelled and people are really not getting paid. They're getting paid cents on the dollar, basically. And it is also intertwined with animal oppression because people are, like, inmates are now filleting fish, they are harvesting honey, they are milking goats and cows, etc. And a lot of those products are ending up in Whole Foods. So you can see that the oppression of animals, the oppression of humans, it's often interlinked. As well, the siting of slaughterhouses is an environmental justice issue. It involves environmental racism because slaughterhouses are typically sited in poor communities. They're sited right next to poor communities of color predominantly. And as I mentioned at the start of the talk, these communities are then experiencing just absolutely atrocious health effects from living there. So, for example, if we want to block the siting of new slaughterhouses, we're going to have to stand in solidarity with environmental justice movements, with movements against environmental racism. So we really do have to link animal liberation with broader human liberation if we want to grow this movement and become more relevant. I was recently on a podcast called the Horror Vanguard podcast, and we were discussing a film called Raw, it's a horror film, which has a lot of animal liberation messages. And we were talking about what's really behind a lot of different systems of oppression, and especially what's behind carnism, is basically this disrespect or violating the bodily autonomy of other sentient beings for power, for pleasure, for greed. So patriarchy, capitalism, racism, etc., they violate people's autonomy. They prohibit them from being truly self-determining beings for power, for greed, for pleasure. Scholars of environmental ethics and vegan anarchist scholars will argue that carnism is often the gateway drug into other forms of oppression, and by that I mean oppression of people and of the environment. So once you learn it's okay to oppress one, it becomes easier to oppress others or to marginalize them, to dehumanize or animalize them to whatever extent. So I'm arguing today that the vegan movement has a lot to gain from really politicizing animal rights and linking up with broader movements that are increasingly coalescing to stand against this exploitative, colonial, capitalist framework, including movements like Extinction Rebellion, including LGBTQ rights movements, including indigenous sovereignty movements, including Black Lives Matter, etc. And so although I will call for people to consume vegan as much as is possible and to try and convince all your friends and family to consume vegan as much as is possible, I also want to challenge us to keep our eye on the bigger picture and to really get political in our demands. So again, if people are struggling to access vegan products, we need to dismantle those barriers. And ultimately, we need to reclaim this economy, we need to reclaim our global food system so that it feeds the needs of people and animals and the planet and not just the needs of big capital. So as Indigenous leader Arthur Manuel says, Mother Earth cannot simply be reduced to the industrial binary of profit and garbage. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mexie. We will be having the panel discussion with all the speakers at 5:15 right here. We have time for just a couple quick questions. If something's really pressing for Mexie right now that you want to ask, if there's any questions.
Did you say it was 22% meat ended up in land?
26.2% of meat ends up. 26.2% of all meat in the U.S. and the U.S. retail market ends up in the garbage in the landfills. So, yeah. Question here?
Sorry, how many people or activists does the animal feed industry kill in the Amazon every year?
I'm not sure on the figure of how many people it kills, but certainly the workers are being grossly mistreated, and of course, the environment is suffering, and so it's hard to say, because as I said, people who live near slaughterhouses, the people who are living anywhere near these concentrated factory farms, are dying of respiratory illnesses, brain damage, other problems of breathing in the toxic fumes, and also drinking the water that's been polluted from the manure. So
It's just people who are trying to protect the rainforest, they're getting themselves killed too, right?
yes, yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah, no, there's Bolsonaro down there, so it's a whole other story. But yeah, it's not a good situation.
One more question right here.
I was just wondering, sorry. And then obviously the U.S. is a big leader in this global capitalist economy, right? So do you think that if in the 2020 election Bernie, let's just say, is elected, that's going to start to shift a lot of these things that you've been talking about? Or do you think it needs to, like, do we need to have like a full-on revolution outside of our current political system?
Yeah, so I'm actually pretty radical, so I do think we need pretty radical change, but I will say that I am very excited about Bernie Sanders, because, you know, even a few years ago, you couldn't even say the word socialism without people just being like, oh my gosh, you know, get out of here, right? And I think that he's really done a lot to make it okay for people to start thinking about class politics, to start thinking about struggle for the working class and not just for, you know, the rich, right? And so I am really excited about you know, the shift in the discourse that I've seen even in the past few years, right? You know, and in the debates that we're seeing, the political debates, now people are really being forced to go to the left to get any kind of traction. So I think that does represent a big shift, and I think it is encouraging. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll take a break there until the panel at 5:15. Thank you so much, Mexie, for your talk today. And just a reminder that Vegfest is 100% volunteer run. Everything that's done to bring this to life is all volunteer hours by the heart and the goodness of people in this community that believe in this community, and all the donations raised help to put on next year's event. So keep the social media conversation going. Hashtag Vegfest Calgary 2019 and hashtag Calgary Goes Vegan, and a reminder about those awesome prizes up for grabs.